Brian Caldwell cut me off with a raised hand. Not a question, not a pause. A flat, dismissive gesture, like silencing a waiter who spoke out of turn. "Let's not dramatize this," he said, eyes flicking past me to the others in the room. "This is an attitude problem." The word landed harder than the termination itself. The story you're about to hear includes dramatized elements and composite characters, created with the help of AI to convey a stronger emotional and educational message. If this kind of content isn't for you, feel free to step away, take a break, and take care of yourself. The room went quiet. Not respectful quiet, watching quiet. The kind where people lean back slightly, relieved it isn't happening to them. Brian didn't look at me when he continued. He spoke to the table, to the air, to the spreadsheet version of me he'd already decided to erase. "This role requires alignment," he said. "And frankly, Willa, your tone has become difficult." A faint smile. "Polite, surgical. We're optimizing leadership costs." 17 years collapsed into a sentence. No performance issues, no missed targets, no warnings, just attitude issues. Spoken like a diagnosis he didn't bother to prove. Human resources sat beside him, nodding, fingers hovering over a keyboard, already documenting my flaw into permanence. I didn't interrupt him again. I didn't defend myself. I didn't remind him that half the clients still on our books were there, because I'd saved them from mistakes he never acknowledged. Brian had already decided I was a problem. Problems don't get voices. He slid the folder toward me. 7 documents. Termination notice, acknowledgements, releases, assumptions. The room waited for me to react for anger, humiliation, bargaining. Brian finally looked at me then, curious, like he wanted to see how someone breaks. I gave him nothing. I read every page, slowly. I signed exactly where they asked. Each signature calm, intentional, final. The tension drained from the room. Brian leaned back, satisfied, another expensive personality removed. I placed my badge, phone, and laptop on the table and stood without a word. What Brian Caldwell didn't realize was this. By humiliating me, by calling it attitude, by firing me without cause, he had just triggered the one clause he should have feared most. How are you holding up right now? Moments like this can stir up old memories we don't always talk about, if you can. Light a small scented candle and let the room slow down with you. Sometimes a steady flame helps steady the mind. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read every comment. And you're not alone here. And if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing, because what happened next is where the silence finally started to speak. I walked out of the building with my termination papers folded neatly in my bag, and the bitterness finally had space to breathe. For 16 years, I had given this company my judgment, my weekends, my reputation. I closed deals no one else could touch. I rebuilt relationships Brian Caldwell nearly destroyed before he even noticed them. Clients asked for me by name, not because I was pleasant, but because I was honest. That honesty was the problem. Brian is the new CEO, but he's never liked being challenged. In meetings, he smiled at agreement and stiffened at questions. He praised enthusiasm over accuracy, speed over depth. The younger hires learned quickly nod, echo his language, never slow him down with inconvenient facts. They were rewarded with visibility. I was labeled difficult. I remembered the night I stayed awake rewriting a proposal to save a strategic account worth 8 figures. I remembered flying home after midnight to be back at my desk by morning. None of that appeared in the room when Brian decided my attitude no longer fit the culture he wanted. Experience made me expensive. Independence made me risky. As the weeks replayed themselves in my head, the pattern sharpened. The senior voices were leaving, the careful ones, the ones who asked why. Brian wasn't optimizing leadership, he was pruning resistance. What stung wasn't the firing, it was the pretense. The idea that silence and obedience were being sold as values. I hadn't lost my job because I was negative. I lost it because I wouldn't bow. And yet, beneath the bitterness, there was something steadier, months earlier. When the language started to shift, I had prepared. I reviewed my contract. I documented everything. I didn't stop him. I waited. Because I knew exactly how this story would turn against him eventually, very slowly. The night after my termination, I opened the old employment agreement I hadn't looked at in years, not out of nostalgia, but habit. 16 years in corporate negotiations had taught me that contracts never forget. Even when people do. The document was dated from a different era of the company, back when my retention actually mattered, back when leadership negotiated instead of dictated. There it was, buried in plain language, a protection clause tied to involuntary termination without documented cause. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just precise. It required justification, process, and evidence. If those were missing, compensation was triggered automatically. No debate, no discretion. I felt nothing when I read it. No thrill, just confirmation. I thought about how human resources handled documents. I remembered the annual compliance reviews, the mass emails asking executives to sign and return by Friday. I remembered how no one ever compared versions. They trusted process, not content. Efficiency over scrutiny. I had submitted revised acknowledgments before. Small clarifications. Nothing controversial. HR filed them without comment. Without legal review. Without questions. Under Brian Caldwell, speed mattered more than understanding. That culture was his signature. He streamlined everything except risk. He replaced review with assumptions. He believed authority eliminated friction. The system worked because most people never tested it. They signed, complied, and left quietly when told. Brian counted on that silence. As I turned the pages, I saw the arrogance clearly. The company had layered policy over policy, assuming newer rules erased older agreements. They didn't. Contracts don't dissolve because leadership changes. They wait. What Brian never bothered to ask was whether I had noticed the shift. Whether I had adapted, months before my termination, when the language turned colder and the meetings shorter. I had reviewed every binding document in my file. I didn't protest. I didn't warn anyone. I simply made sure the record reflected the agreements they had already accepted. The clause he triggered wasn't hidden. It wasn't clever. It was enforceable. And as I closed the folder, one thought settled with quiet certainty. That clause wasn't alone. There were cross-references, addenda, and signatures attached to it, all accepted years earlier without resistance. Each one reinforced the same requirement: documented cause. Brian had dismissed me with a phrase. The system he trusted required proof. That imbalance was not emotional, it was structural, and it was already working in my favor. Quietly. If you think you've figured it out, the next part will prove you haven't. The evening settled into an unnatural calm, the kind that follows impact. I cooked dinner slowly, cleaned the counter, folded a load of laundry, and acted like my career hadn't just been erased. No emails, no meetings, no badge buzzing at the door. The silence wasn't peaceful, but it was useful. It gave me space to wait. I didn't check my phone. I knew when it would ring. Companies panic on schedules, not emotions. I set a plate on the table, poured a glass of water, and reviewed nothing. Preparation was already done. All that remained was timing. The call came just after nightfall. An unfamiliar number, corporate cadence. I answered on the third ring. "Willa Hayes," the man asked. His voice was careful, measured, already strained. He introduced himself as company counsel, then paused, as if deciding how much authority he still had. He said there were questions regarding the documents I had signed earlier that day. His confidence was gone, replaced by caution. I listened without interrupting. I let the silence do its work. Then he asked it. Softly. Precisely. "Did you read page 5? I looked at the contract copy on my table. Exactly where I had placed it. Page 5, subsection 3. The sentence Brian Caldwell never noticed. The sentence human resources never flagged. The sentence their process accepted without review." "Yes," I said. I did. Another pause. Papers shifting. Breathing too close to the receiver. "I need to be clear," he said. "You reviewed the entire document before signing every page, every line, every cross-reference." I thought about how quickly they had slid the folder across the table, how relieved they had looked when I didn't argue. Every word. I said. The silence that followed was heavier than anger. It was calculation. I could hear him realizing the order of operations had reversed. The firing was finished. The consequences were just beginning. When the call ended, I returned my phone to the table and finished my meal. Nothing had changed outwardly, but somewhere downtown, an assumption had collapsed, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to wait with certainty. I knew the next move would not be loud, dramatic, or public, but slow, procedural, and inevitable, unfolding through documents, calendars, and signatures that no amount of executive confidence could interrupt or undo once the machinery had been set fully in motion. The panic didn't arrive all at once. It leaked. By morning, my phone showed 3 missed calls from the same firm number. By noon, an email followed, marked urgent, requesting clarification on executed documents. The tone was no longer procedural. It was defensive. They had found it. When my attorney called me, her voice was calm, almost amused. They discovered the termination clause. She said, the one tied to involuntary dismissal without documented cause. She paused. And they are not taking it well. Inside the company, the reaction was louder than anything Brian Caldwell had said in that glass room. I later learned he stormed into human resources, demanding to know how a clause like that existed. This was never approved. He snapped. Legal pushed back. It was approved. Someone replied, years ago, and it's enforceable. The mistake wasn't the clause. It was the assumption that no one would notice when it was triggered. I refused every request to speak directly. When Brian emailed me personally, I didn't reply. When his assistant called, I let it ring. My response was simple and final. All communication goes through counsel. Silence. Again. Doing its work. Through my attorney. I heard fragments. We need to reinterpret this. Can we argue intent? What if we claim it's outdated? Each suggestion died the same way. Signed contracts don't age out because leadership changes. They wait. Then the number appeared. The compensation wasn't symbolic. It wasn't severance. It was contractual obligation. Years of base pay, accelerated equity, deferred incentives, benefits, interest. When my attorney totaled it, she didn't soften the delivery. This is significantly higher than they expected. She said, they were budgeting for 0. That was the moment satisfaction pressed against my ribs. Tight but contained. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I understood what this really was. Not revenge, exposure. Brian Caldwell had believed authority could outrun paper. He believed firing me quietly would erase risk. Instead, he activated it, and now his legal team wasn't asking whether they owed me money. They were asking how much more this was going to cost. Total, everything you've heard so far is true, but it's not the whole truth. I expected resistance, but not the kind they chose. The company's first response was delay. Emails framed as clarifications, meetings postponed, deadlines quietly ignored. Then came denial. Legal suggested the clause was outdated, misfiled, misunderstood. One message read, "This provision was never intended to apply in this context." That sentence told me everything. Intent is irrelevant when signatures exist. Pressure followed. A representative hinted that prolonged dispute would complicate future opportunities. Another warned that litigation would be emotionally taxing. I found those lines revealing. When organizations can't win on facts, they test endurance. My view is simple pressure is just noise designed to make people abandon leverage they already earned. I didn't respond emotionally. I didn't argue character or fairness. Through my attorney, I answered once. Clearly, the agreement is valid. The termination was undocumented. The obligation stands. Nothing more. Silence again, measured and deliberate. What unraveled them wasn't my position, but their own records. Each attempt to discredit the clause required explaining how it entered my file. That meant emails, approvals, HR timestamps, digital signatures. Every document pointed the same direction. They had accepted it, filed it, and relied on it for years. The pushback collapsed under its own weight. Then a new threat appeared. My attorney forwarded an internal message accidentally copied too wide. It referenced similar agreements and asked whether exposure extended beyond me. That was the moment the pressure shifted. I wasn't an anomaly. I was a pattern. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Brian Caldwell's strategy hadn't failed because of me. It failed because it assumed everyone would leave quietly. By the time the company stopped pushing and started calculating, the tone had changed. They weren't disputing validity anymore. They were estimating damage. And for the first time since the meeting ended, I understood the scale. This wasn't a single conflict. It was the beginning of something they could no longer contain. That understanding brought focus, not fear, reminding me that leverage multiplies when systems repeat mistakes, and that pressure, once redirected, exposes exactly who built the risk and who merely triggered it themselves now. Before I go on, how do you think this will end? The shift happened quietly at first, then all at once. My attorney called to tell me another former executive had reached out, then another, different departments, same timeline, same language used during termination, not a culture fit, attitude concerns, leadership alignment. The pattern wasn't subtle anymore, it was procedural. Each conversation added weight. These weren't people chasing revenge. They were professionals comparing notes, realizing the same script had been read to all of us. Under Brian Caldwell, dissent had been relabeled as dysfunction. Experience had been reclassified as cost. Once that framing was established, removals became efficient. The legal team saw it next. What started as one file turned into a stack. Similar contracts, similar clauses, similar failures to document cause. Their internal emails changed tone, shifting from defense to containment. Words like exposure, aggregation, and precedent appeared where denial used to live. That was when the board stepped in. I wasn't present for those meetings, but the results traveled fast. External counsel was brought in. Termination records were requested. HR procedures were audited retroactively. Brian's strategy, once praised for decisiveness, was now being reviewed for risk. Systems built on speed were being forced to explain themselves slowly. The calls I received reflected the chaos. Lawyers asking for timelines, former colleagues asking what I knew, everyone suddenly careful with language, aware that every phrase now mattered. What struck me most was how fragile confidence becomes when documentation is required. Then the confirmation arrived. Brian Caldwell was under internal investigation, not announced, not public, but real. His decisions, his directives, his emails were being examined by the same standards he had ignored. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who dismissed process as bureaucracy was now constrained by it. As the situation escalated, my role diminished. I had already done what was necessary. The system was responding to itself. One termination had revealed many. One clause had exposed a habit. The dominoes kept falling without my involvement. I didn't celebrate. I didn't comment. I watched the structure I had trusted finally enforce its own rules. And for the first time since that meeting, the chaos wasn't around me. It was where it belonged. The settlement meeting was scheduled for mid-morning. Deliberately neutral, deliberately quiet. No courtroom, no audience. Just a conference room borrowed from an outside firm, where tone mattered more than volume. I arrived early. Not from nerves, but habit. When you've spent years preparing for consequences, punctuality becomes muscle memory. The documents were already laid out when I sat down. Clean copies, final language, numbers that no longer felt abstract. The compensation reflected what the contract required, not what the company preferred. Base pay, accelerated incentives, benefits continuation, a neutral reference letter drafted with careful, bloodless wording, everything accounted for, nothing excessive, nothing symbolic. Brian Caldwell wasn't there. I noticed immediately. And then I stopped noticing. His absence said more than any statement could have. Negotiations don't exclude decision-makers unless something has shifted behind the scenes. I didn't ask where he was. I didn't need to. As my attorney reviewed the final terms, I listened with a steady detachment that surprised even me. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of victory, just closure. I've learned that when outcomes are earned through process rather than persuasion, emotion tends to arrive late. If at all, I signed once. Then again, each page precise, final. The company representative thanked me for my professionalism. I nodded. Professionalism is often just restraint mistaken for grace. I gathered my copy of the agreement, stood, and left without a word. No handshake, no speech, no satisfaction performed for anyone else's comfort. Outside, the day continued like nothing had happened. Traffic moved, phones rang, deadlines existed for people who still believed momentum protected them. I walked a full block before my attorney caught up to me. "There's one more thing," she said carefully. "You should know this wasn't just about you." That was when she told me. Brian Caldwell had been asked to resign. Not immediately, not publicly, but decisively. The investigation had reached a conclusion the board couldn't ignore. His approach carried too much risk, too many liabilities, too many documents contradicting his explanations. I listened without reacting. That wasn't my win to claim. It was the system correcting itself. I went home, placed the signed agreement in a drawer, and closed it gently. Some victories don't ask for celebration. They ask for distance. And that day, distance felt exactly right. The weeks after the settlement unfolded with a strange, steady rhythm, like a system recalibrating itself. The company announced a leadership transition framed as strategic renewal. Clients read it differently. Accounts paused. Two long-standing partners quietly moved their business elsewhere. Trust, once questioned, doesn't return on schedule. From a distance, I watched without satisfaction. The organization didn't collapse dramatically. It thinned. Good people left. Meetings grew smaller. Decisions slowed. Reputation eroded not through scandal, but through quiet doubt, justice. I realized, rarely arrives with spectacle. It operates through consequences that compound. Meanwhile, my phone began ringing for a different reason. Former clients reached out cautiously at first, asking if I was available for a conversation. Consulting. They called it short-term, flexible, independent. I accepted selectively, on my terms. No internal politics, no forced alignment, just work. Then something unexpected happened. People Brian Caldwell had removed began contacting me. Senior analysts, account leads, operations directors. The same ones labeled difficult, resistant, expensive. Each conversation felt familiar. Each story followed the same curve. I offered them contracts, not promises, work based on respect, not silence. We built slowly, no press, no branding blitz, just delivery. The first quarter surpassed projections. The second confirmed it wasn't luck. By the end of the year, the numbers were unmistakable. Revenue exceeded what I had earned at the company that fired me. Expenses were leaner, decisions clearer, accountability shared. The irony wasn't lost on me. The structure Brian dismissed as inefficient had been the one holding value together. Once removed, the gap showed. My new firm didn't grow because of revenge. It grew because experience compounds when it's allowed to speak. Occasionally, I heard updates. The former company restructured again. Another client departed. Another initiative stalled. New leadership tried to repair what speed had broken. Some damage doesn't reverse. The twist came quietly. In an annual report, I almost skipped. My firm's revenue line crossed the figure I once thought was my ceiling. I closed the document and sat back. Not smiling, but breathing easier. Justice had finished its work. Recovery had begun, and for the first time in years. My future felt built, not defended. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was mine. Earned carefully, And it finally felt sustainable and genuinely lasting growth. I didn't leave that chapter feeling triumphant. I left it aligned. This was never emotional revenge, never about humiliating Brian Caldwell. It was about honoring a contract. And contracts don't care about ego. They care about what was signed, what was ignored, and what was triggered. Brian believed authority could outrun structure. He believed speed mattered more than process, and silence meant weakness. He was wrong. Silence can be discipline. Silence creates time. And time, used well, turns preparation into leverage. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I read, documented, and waited. When the system finally moved, it moved without drama. That's how real accountability works. It doesn't shout, it calculates. Watching it resolve taught me something I carry forward now. Power isn't control over people, it's control over position. It's knowing where responsibility begins and ends, and refusing to absorb what isn't yours. Brian wasn't defeated by me. He was defeated by the rules he dismissed as inconvenience. The same system he trusted to protect him enforced consequences instead. So this is the lesson I leave you with. Silence isn't weakness. Preparation is power. When you know your ground, you don't need permission to stand on it. When I look back on everything that happened, the lesson isn't about winning, it's about staying intact. I learned that dignity doesn't come from being loud, but from knowing your ground and standing on it quietly. Fear fades when you understand your own worth, and preparation turns anxiety into calm. If you were inside this story with me, would you change any moment? Was there one detail that stayed with you longer than the rest? And where are you listening from right now? I'd really love to know. If this story moved you, leave a comment, tap like, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe, so we can keep walking through stories like this together.